Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the podcast Point Counterpoint. I'm your host, Chris Wright. This is a Counterpoint media production, and today I brought on Daniel Sanderson. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Daniel Sanderson, and I'm the most relevant thing is that I'm a philosopher and the owner of a media outlet called Planksip. So, yeah, that's probably the most relevant for the conversation, I think.
Sure. We can just start with what got you interested in philosophy? What's your background there?
My background was a very natural form of, of philosophy, something that I wasn't even really aware of. I would say back in 2016, I could barely make myself through uh, some of these really dense philosophy books, like something from Descartes or Hegel or Schopenhauer or something like that. It'd just be like too hard for me to concentrate on. Um, Somebody told me one time and I can empathize with it. You read one paragraph and you're like, I don't understand anything in that paragraph. I got to reread it. And then how many attempts before you're like, I'm not ready for this. Right. And so I thought of that as a challenge. And surprisingly, there's a lot of philosophy groups around. I think I used a combination of Meetup, right? This one particular platform where there's a lot of groups that meet up and do that. I also volunteered with a local university to run philosophy cafes, and so I guess it kind of started from there.
All right, and you said that you're mostly influenced by Platonic thinking. Would you explain that how you use the Platonic philosophy to influence your own thought?
Yeah, I think I approached it very objectively. I've gone to a variety of different sources or resources, turn to and continue to turn to them. So, for example, the closest proximity that we would see to Plato would be, other than Socrates, which would
Yeah.
be would be Aristotle, right? And as a layman coming into this, you start to think, well, do I pick Aristotle? Do I pick Plato? And you realize history kind of did that. It kind of went down two kind of paths, and then academically, we kind of summarize the Platonic piece as being something that eventually led to religion, right? That monotheistic tradition, and then we also say that or ideological thinking, right? If you really want to put it into a box. The other one is Aristotle and Aristotle's, keep it grounded sort of thing, and trying to figure out, uh, like empirically look at and count things and make observations in the world, right? And so when I do those two as a comparison, I think they work really well together. Um, and I think that it's really in its entirety requires both of them uh, extensively and necessary for both of those to be. It's not an ideological binary choice one way or another. It's how do we do that? How do we work with those two kinds of spaces, right? And I think that we can learn a lot from that, because if that's your starting point, what can we derive in terms of wisdom? Then you're not really taking a position as you're right or you're wrong, right? And it's not entirely a pluralist, equal sort of relativist position either. It's a real, I think, it's a helpful position. It's a helpful position, and ultimately still gives 100% of the autonomy to the individual. But I think intuitively we know what provides more value. And I think maybe we can be a little bit secular, or like circle cyclicer in time. We could get to a point where we maybe emphasize one or the other, right? And I would never say that's part of my idea of how I view the world, but I think as a metaphor, I could describe that to you. You can understand what I'm talking about. And then I think the idea about description is that this is that pathway into subjectivity that I think is the most efficient. You can understand what I'm talking about, and we haven't crossed the line to say that this is a universal, essential way that the universe is structured, right? Where academics seem to want to like push right there, right? It's like they want to go right for, and I think there's a really important other step that's needed before you rush to that finish line.
Yeah, it's kind of like the one thing you mentioned reminded me of the famous painting, The School of Athens, and you have Plato pointing up, Aristotle pointing down, and it kind of shows the two different ways of thinking. But really, they really do work together very well. I mean, without Plato, you would have no Aristotle. There, it kind of focuses on two different things. That one way I've seen it described is when you read Aristotle, you read De Anima or something, and you're going through and you're like, yep, makes sense. It's yep, good conclusion. Completely solid, makes complete sense. Very logical, analytical. And then you're reading Plato, and it's like, yes, it's a very different feeling.
Yeah. So, okay, well, that's a little bit revealing. So I want to share that experience with you. So, let's say you put it on a frustration scale and you said, well, look, I really, the neurons that are firing, they're pleasure neurons. I'm reading it, the axioms and the statements and the syllogisms, they all make sense. They all play out. And then it's all like ding, 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 right? Like, but when you read Plato, it's like contradiction, frustration, right? So is that really what you're saying? Like, I mean, it's a great observation, but would you say that's how you would balance the two?
I wouldn't say it's contradictory. It's just they just come to. It's more intuitive. Like it's more of like a revelation type of experience where it's like you see it just automatically clicks. It's more literature because it's not as analytical, professional philosophy in the same way that Aristotle is. Yeah, he wrote it in more of a sort of a layman's type thing. So in more understandable, whereas Aristotle, where it's very clear, understandable, but it's not in that kind of popular style.
Yeah, I totally
The
agree.
dialogue.
And so somebody who might be your nemesis might say, right, say, that experience that you're describing is like, I can't stand the logical part of Aristotle, but I can love the world and how he taps into an imaginative, sort of thing. Like you can start to kind of categorize these two kinds of people, and just from an observation standpoint, you're going to say, we're probably a mix of both of those, right? But people may gravitate towards maybe one way or another, and so I think the plurality that we introduced, or that I was talking about, is a network effect. It's an aggregate effect that you have, people. It's not like unlimited perspectives. You typically take and consume that information in that particular way. Where we're in a frustrating or maybe amazing time is that we have such an abundance to evergreen content, in addition to a whole bunch of noise. And we're not all philosophers. We're usually relegated to the smallest section in the bookstore. I mean, self-help is 10 times bigger than philosophy section, and that saddens me. That's it means that we have a shallow society, and we're not doing our job as philosophers, and we can do better.
Yeah, it saddens me as well. I love I love philosophy. I love for more people to be interested in it, but unfortunately, it's a lot of the writing is probably not accessible to most people. It's not presented in an interesting enough way, or people don't get that healthy introduction to it.
Yeah. To change the topic a little bit, do you play video games?
Not really. No.
Well, I have an Xbox, right? And my son has an Xbox, and I don't know, he doesn't play it as much anymore, but I play this game called Destiny,
Hmm.
and I just think it's an amazing game, right? So you can, I mean, it's a shooter game, right? So I mean, I'm not trying to go down a pathway or endorse any kind of shooting. It's just I don't think it makes me more aggressive. Not saying that that doesn't do it to some people, but for me, it's cool to be kind of like a like a military dude in the future running around kind of shooting aliens, right? I think it's fun.
Yeah.
So, anyways, what I understood is that there's kind of some lumps you have to pay in order to myelinate anything or grow any sort of like real attachment to things. We do see this in a religious context with like rolling of the rosary beads and stuff like that. It's that tactile sort of, and we have this ability now to tap into a video game, which anybody that's not seeing me in the video, and it's just on that. You've got my hands like this controller of an Xbox controller out in front of me, the thumbs going, and fingers moving and stuff like that, right? Well, this is directly tapping into like very quick problem solving ability, even stuff that's very autonomous, right? Like movement and everything. So it's quite an interesting, I think it's just a marvel to look at it in that particular way. And yet the social commentary is very much about, this is going to degrade society and we're going to turn into this or that or blah, it's just so much fear and trepidation around every almost benign sort of like activity, right? And excess attribution to like causality. There's a shooting somewhere and it's like, well, there's too much violence in the video. It's like, come on, right? Like, okay, let's eliminate all that. Now, will it disappear? I mean, come on, you really that
It's not inherent.
irrational?
Yeah, of course, like anything, it can be misused, but it's not. It can be used for good, certainly. Those video games. Yeah, but I like what you said about humans are very tactile people. Where we really connect more to something when we can really feel it. We can engage in all the senses, and it's a very Aristotelian way of seeing things. Is that we're not like these. Of course, the Aristotelian soul is like the soul is not some separate thing that's trapped inside the body. It's like the the soul and the body are together combined within one hylomorphic union, and so we connect to the universals through the senses
And the imagination, right?
and the yep.
Because
But
and I think this
we
is our
get input through the senses that then goes to the imagination.
yeah. Well, I mean,
Mhm.
and I've thought about this because it comes up. I think especially in I think probably Descartes forward, but more like Immanuel Kant. And I kind of have a unique framing on that. It's not a conclusion by any means, and it's not intended to devalue any of the value of Immanuel Kant on forward. But I found that in that particular time period, Newton. There's a part of the influence of Isaac Newton and the deterministic, godlike quality that the scientific community kind of morphed into, right? I mean, you saw the emergence of somebody with you see a lot of ambition in culture from academics. So you'll see Marx trying to take on the huge ambition of trying to describe sociology, and this is what Marxism, that's Marxism.
Mhm.
And then you have Immanuel Kant, who tried to empiricize philosophy. And I would say that he was largely successful, but ultimately is the framing and the explanation and the description of the world any better in comparison to the Greeks, right? So that's that qualifier is better.
Mhm.
And is it easier or simpler to understand, or does it relegate it into the complexity of academic interpretation and a new version of a priestly class where even the priests don't agree and the layman hasn't any idea of how to intuitively feel what it means to be a Kantian? They have to be told by somebody what it feels like to be a Kantian and be like, so I'm feeling this. And so I think you have to take it down to its core elements. And I think that this is where a Platonic philosophy is maybe undervalued, because it's kind of prematurely dismissed. But let's take a point and say that our worlds are constructed in our imaginations. Right now, let's be skeptical about that right away and say, obviously, the real world is not created in our imaginations. One's nothing, and the other one's something. Right? And physics doesn't work that way. Right? Okay. But we all have to run through your senses, as you mentioned. We have to. That's our intake valve, right? This is how we live, is based off of the intake of that information stream coming into our. And Descartes does an amazing job describing that. I think what's difficult about it is how intuitive it is to fill out that portion that is subjectivity, and how to bring it into something like the Greeks would try and make it wholesome, right? Now, in my opinion, in our most recent version of, I guess we'd say modernity, monotheism, and on forward, we've taken this ideal of the Greeks, this monotheistic God of wisdoms, right, with an S, plurality, and we all know that there's a move from polytheism to monotheism, but it originated from this concept of good. So good became God, and the pagan worship of sun became very suited to this lineage form of transmission from father to son and mother to daughter, and these values that you transfer down through family units. And lo and behold, you've got all these ideological forms that start to emerge in various different forms, throughout religion, right? And they're great models. They're ideal, in fact. And so, that's where I can see the criticism Plato emerging from. But I can also see that Plato's capability is, if on a fundamental level, you say, okay, well, what is he describing? He's describing our ability to form abstract thoughts. And so before we put any other information or contaminate that with, that is the essence of what it means to be human, right? Like, you may derive something from it, and it may be something completely different, or something, it may blossom into something different. Like Chris Wright may become X, Y, or Z, or what it means to be Chris in the essence of you, has all the potential that your imagination can actually materialize or replicate in the minds of your network, right? I don't mean social network. I mean in who you've touched and affected and who you've been a part of, right? Okay, and that's quite remarkable, because that exists in a shared imagination. When I say pink elephant, you instantly can form that same image. And since it's so natural, I think people even forget how amazing that is.
Okay, something interested me, because you mentioned about the move from polytheism to monotheism. Maybe there's actually a lot of research that's been done into actually it. There's actually a lot of evidence that shows that it was more likely that it actually went from monotheism more to polytheism, actually, like initially. In that, in fact, if you look at like Hinduism or Shintoism, actually, especially Shintoism, I'll take as an example. If you were to ask like the average person that follows Shintoism, and you asked them how many gods do you worship, they'd say one. But the thing is, all these different communities have different names for the same god. But then what happened is Japan wanted to have a unified religion, even though they're folk religions, and so
Hmm.
they unified them all under one thing of Shintoism and said these are all our gods. But they really, if you were to ask any individual member, and say one, and the same with Hinduism, you'd say they um, initially it was like there's Shiva, Brahman, but it was all one thing, and then eventually it got separated into classifying them as separate gods.
Yeah, you're right. No, you're
Mhm.
right.
Yeah,
And so you just say, is it one of these things like the liar's paradox, where you could say, this sentence is false, right? If you write that statement, well, it's a paradox. Your mind kind of
yeah,
shuts down.
hmm
But as soon as you explain that to me, I'm like, yeah, you're absolutely right. My frame of context was just the um, the
hmm
Greek religion, right?
yeah,
At that time of like 500 BC, to
hmm
then where did it go from there? And then I've had people not challenge but comment on that exact same point. And some people say, well, no, the Abrahamic religion or the Jewish tradition happened before, and this and that, and blah. Right? So I try and leave that out. But you say it's like there's this ideal of hero worship that comes out of Homer, right? And
hmm
so part of the intentional
yeah,
project that somebody like Plato tried to do was take all the amazing new discoveries that his brain and his network, his culture is actually revealing to him, right? He actually really thought it was more about remembering than it was, because it's like the stuff was already there in the ether, even though ether, we know, I'm not saying ether is real, but it's all there, right? In these forms, right? So it's about how do you shape them and pull them into reality and make use of them, right? And so the materialist is going to say, oh, I cannot accept 90% of what you said there, right? And
mhm,
you have to say to me, say, look, use your imagination. This is something that you have to conceptualize in your mind first, and then that together, let's figure out how we could test that. But you're actually putting in this subjective thing now, and why it was different from what you explained. I had a timeline difference. Like I had a specific isolated timeline in mind. And you're absolutely right. Like even the Upanishads, it just means sitting next to, right? And very much it was the Upanishad prior to the ancient Greece, and then also Egyptian influences, right? They had direct influence in the Western development of the Western tradition, right? But yeah, it. I think my point still holds true that it went from a in Greece, it went from like the Greeks, right, who were shaping and forming this starting point. It went from Zeus and all the polytheistic gods, right, the pagan worshippers. It went all the way down, and it started to form itself in the Greek ideal of
hmm
perfectibility,
hmm
Aristotle's golden mean. It didn't matter Plato or Socrates. It was about cultivating virtue and um, becoming a better noble man. That's what it was intended to do. And you say, well, did it do it? And of course, if you're the skeptic and you say, well, there's still slavery, there's this and that, I don't know if we have the ability to turn instantly into something perfect. But what the point was is that we were thinking about how to become in that particular way, right? And realizing that what we imagined and then what we moved towards, primarily through the vehicle of ethical behavior, is is a way to shape and form our world of judgments, and a way to I guess like organically and intellectually, um, it's more than intellectually, but it's just kind of like the ideal birthing place of culture, right? And they're like, and it's not just to Greece. It's like these are the core things that are required for that soil to be as rich as possible, to use that metaphor, right? For things to grow. And what emerged? Democracy and science, and these types of things. So I think, are we better off for that? I hope so. I think it's quite amazing to be me and to have the mind I have, but I'm biased, and you know, right? We
Yes,
we are an
yes.
invasive species, so of course, I mean, of course, the ruler's going to say that.
Mhm. You said that what's within philosophy, what would you say is your main focus of study? Like what's one thing that you really strive to focus on? Is it ethics? Is it metaphysics? Is it what's
I really, I really touch on all of them. I try
Mhm.
and develop a theory of aesthetics, which I think is rooted more in not so much subconscious, but it's more of an ordered arrangement. It's how we organize and put things into categories. Now, the funny thing is that if I were to say, hey, this is my theory of ethics, and I'm going to call it the categorical imperative, right? Well, we know it's like, that's already taken, right? So we can talk about all the trademark copyright thing in the world, but there's this kind of like blocking equity thing that happens with words, right? Like, I don't know, let's use an extreme example here. Okay. Let's use an extreme example. Let's say that our dialogue today, or like cultural dialogue, was moving in a position of racial purity.
Mhm.
Okay. Something like that. Right. Okay.
Okay.
So this idea of racial purity is so presuppositionally contaminated with, I mean, just throw up some images, right? I mean, Hitler, fascism, like racism, and like, you know what I'm saying? So, uh, KKK, all these kinds of like really like,
Mhm.
scary manifestations of our society. Hardly the best of what we've produced, right?
No, no.
And so if you do that and you're coming up with something, it's sometimes hard to like, how do you emphasize beauty, and categories are really kind of like that fundamental substrate of where aesthetics come from. Like, where does beauty come from, right? As one of them. And here I would kind of go into more of an Aristotle way of thinking and breaking them down into a couple different categories. And there would be a biological imperative. You're biologically driven and attracted to some particular person, right? Unfortunately, we use the identity of Chris Wright as your entire lineage through time, the entire time that you have this binomial consciousness of mediated by circadian rhythms, right? Like, you go to sleep, you wake up, you go to sleep, you wake up, you go to sleep. So this is what it looks like. It's going on and off, on and off, on and off, every day of your life for your entire lifetime, right? And then we basically say that signal is you, right? I mean, if you look at it just from that sort of information
Mhm.
flow, and yet the entire, I don't know if it's like, if this statement is correct, but your entire DNA structure gets rewritten every 7 years. Like, what lineage actually goes through, what's remembered, how do cells die? I mean, or cells die and then regenerate, or your full body gets kind of regenerated. I think it's in 7 years or something like that.
Yeah.
So, it's not like it's like, well, I'm Chris version 1, Chris version 2, or Chris version 3. And yet, there is actually market differences, right? Because what Chris is as a toddler is different than what Chris is as a teenager, which is different than what Chris is going to be as a grandpa,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And so these are very fast ways to introduce normative ethics, because it's like, we can say, oh, what's the ideal grandpa? And we can, as a society, all agree that Chris is going to be I want to be kind of like this. Well, why? Well, my grandpa did that, right? And if we're a spiteful society, and if we're an ungrateful society, because I don't want to be like my grandpa. Well, of course, if he hit you and abused you, you don't want to be like him. But what are the good things about him? Or do we always look at the bad sides of people? You know, you know. And I think that's the antidote to today's call out culture. It's like, okay, I understand you want to rip that, statue down because he was a part of imperialist England at the time of conquest, and he held slaves. Okay, I get that. I get that. But before you rip it down, can you at least tell me what good he brought about the world? And
It's
what's
kind of
more
like
edu-
it's kind of like have you heard of a Chesterton's fence before? Uh,
Yeah,
yeah, it's you're coming along and you see the fence at the road, and you want to take it down because it's in your way. But you basically need to assume that there is some other purpose there that you're unaware of before you take it down. So you go and you investigate and find out what is its purpose, and then afterwards, um, if there isn't actually a reason, then you could take it down. But otherwise, you'll probably find that there's probably something else that.
yeah. No, that's exactly what it is. I really like you brought that up. What I would say is that I wish more of our dialogues happened in that way. I think that's a I would say a truer form, but a more ideal form of dialogue is to develop ideas together, right? And so you say, okay, let's reason through this problem together, and you get a bunch of people in the room, and you say, okay, so here's how we're going to kind of do this. We're going to, we're going to think, is it a good idea to tear down this statue, right? We say, okay, that's a very if and maybe so you can imagine you're running the thing, right? And I'm the mayor. Okay, let's just pretend I'm the mayor. Okay, and I sit there and I go, okay, I'm with you guys. If we can reason through this properly and still decide that we're going to go and rip down this statue, I'll go with you and help you rip down the statue. They go, oh, really? Okay, so so you're in it with us. I go, yeah, I'm in it with you. Okay, so let's look at this. He held slaves. He was part of imperialist England. Okay, um, what do you know about him? And if you think from a standpoint of what was it that was good that contributed to society? What was it that made him a leader? For what reason are we putting him there? Was there some fundamental underlying good that he represents? Right. And I'm okay to rip it down, but let's make sure that we understand what was it that was good about it. I mean, if the person making the statue is like, oh, because I want to encourage slavery, because I want to make sure that the realm of England stays on forever,
Or,
um, and continues to extract resources on behalf of, for basically for the mother country, right? For
Mhm.
Mother England, for the Queen, then we say, no, I mean, that we can see obviously everybody knows that there's something wrong with that, right? We all know that there's something wrong with that. So, what was it about their attempts and the people that actually experience that struggle in that life that makes them not worthy of your hatred?
Mhm. Yeah, it's all about really the intention that matters. It's like you see, when we put a statue up, we put it there to commemorate the good that a certain person has given to society. And so you do well, this person helped to you know you put up a statue of like Abraham Lincoln. It's like he helped to free the slaves, he helped to preserve the Union. Well, or anybody you could say that, um, and that would be the intention in putting up the statue. Whereas if it was putting up a statue of, say, Jefferson Davis, and let's say this was a very pro-slavery person, they did that because they're pro-slavery. Look at the intention. Uh, oh, that's an evil intention. Then there is a reason to take it down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. No,
yeah.
that's
No,
well, and I'll give you an option between take down and put up, right? And take down is that's a real dramatic
yeah.
thing. And I know I have a bias. I'm just totally not a Rousseauian. I'm not about revolution. I
Mhm.
think we live in the most prosperous time in the world that the last thing we need is a revolution. We have so much to be grateful for in our society, right? And I think that is forgotten very, very quickly. Okay. I mean, another Platonic
Will
thing that
too easily
Matt,
go astray.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. So I think that you have to kind of be really, um, well, let me give you one scenario that is different than the take it down or my idol is better than your idol. Okay.
Mhm.
Let's say you want to take it down, and then do you want to put another one up? And they say, yeah, we want to put up Chief so and so, okay, because he was he was really important for this land,
Hmm.
okay. And I say, well, let me offer one other thing. Instead of taking that one down,
Just have both of them.
let's have both of them. Let's put another one right beside him, you
Hmm.
know. And I'll be kind of a douchebag here. And I'll say, actually, we could take him with his shirt off, flexing and being like, oh, I'm bigger than you, sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
But I'm trying to put a little bit of humor into that to say, you see how ridiculous it is, right? So
Mhm.
that future generations can go, oh, yeah, there was this really goofy, right? Like, I'm not saying what you're doing is wrong or taking it down is wrong. Maybe I'm just too, maybe the optimal path is just to rip the shit down, put new stuff up, and this is progress, like just demolish everything,
Mhm. Yeah.
and even if it's only half true, let's just say it is, and just everybody agree, and let's get all the old farts out of there, right?
Hmm.
And you realize that I've just very succinctly defined what post-modernity is in terms of a cultural critique. It's kind of like this gnawing, sort of similar kind of, let's just take it down, dude. It's like, reminds me of like Lord of the Flies. Like, you you're just gonna fall into like weirdness, because there is information and wisdom out there, and it does transfer across societies.
Yep.
And it's been a great safety net. Another Platonic. What do you mean? Is there a net there? I fall off the cliff. Is he going to catch me? No, you dummy.
Hmm.
Right? I'm using a metaphor. So it's purposeful. What is metaphor? It's for being able to convey that information and concepts where you say, like, a point and a line is like this stick, right? They go, oh yeah, vertical. Oh, but you can turn it this way, yep, and you can turn it. It's like what it's like. It's like that, right?
Yep.
Mathematically, we have a representation of what a point is, and we also have representation of what a line is, right? And so, what are those ideal forms? How do they translate into the world? And how does the world of trigonometry relate onto the reality of, I guess, what the world is trying to tell us, right?
Hmm. Yep.
So that's more of an Einsteinian sort of Gödel thing. It's like the world is intelligible. That means it does rational things. Not that it's a thinking thing, but that's why, if we're following reason, we're uncovering that sort of thing, right? This is what reason is, kind of negotiating reality in that particular way, right? And
Yes.
if you use abstract thinking as a way to reveal that or remember those things, right? Then that's Platonic thinking for you.
Hmm. You you mentioned that one thing that you study is beauty and aesthetics. What is beauty? How would you how would you define
Yeah.
that?
Well, here's the thing. I think this is my weakest one. And I guess maybe I love talking about my weakest one, because in the true form of dialectic, we can hopefully move it a little bit closer. But I found that, just like free will, people would talk back and forth about what it meant. And there was always this, like, there's a really hard way to kind of figure out where those boundary conditions are, right?
Hmm.
And so I think, just as a matter of like, I figured it out, I'm just trying to like reason through one to say, well, what if it's just at a fundamental level, our ability to separate things? That's fundamentally what it is, right? Like, you can't call it all of a sudden now that's beauty, because, I mean, there's all sorts of ways, right? And you say, okay, so then you could say there's beauty that's worthless, right? Because we sort things all the time, right? But if I'm the kind of person that is meticulous about my surroundings, and I set my dinner table very interestingly every night, right? There's the placemat. It's like 3/4 of an inch away from the edge of the table. Each one of them are symmetrically laid out. Your cup is in a very specific 45-degree from like the corner of your plate, and everything is kind of lined up, and the arc of the knife is all the, you say this is just being anal, there's no particular, but you have to admit at some level, what are you using in order to create this, right? And so I thought, rather than the perception of what beauty is, why not try and understand that it's all derived from humans, right? I mean, at least we're talking about human beauty here, right? So what is it that we're doing when we attempt to create beauty, right? And
You're bringing
if
order.
and then I said, well, let's make the assumption that it's ordered.
Decreasing the entropy, you could describe it.
Yeah, exactly. Like participating in that, right? And I don't want to even get into a free will sort of thing. I'm just saying you find yourself participating in it, which actually emanates and projects in a consciousness sort of thing. Lightly on the word projection, because I'm not saying anything like that theater mind thing that Dennett attacked. It's like, I get it, man. There is no theater. There's no homunculi, all this kind of stuff. But I'm like, I'm using metaphor because I'm trying to communicate it in a way that I think you'll understand. And if you say, well, I don't have an imagination, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, well, we have nothing to talk about, right? Like, unless you're incorporating how the neurons basically get from one side of the synaptic field to the other side of the synaptic field, right? Unless you color that for me in the best form of storytelling, right? Unless you do that, I'm going to say you're giving up something, right? Because I'm saying there's an ideal way to color that, and you're saying there is no color, there is no blue, right? I'm going to say this. We go back to color theory. It's like, well, what does blue feel like to you? Well, it feels different than red does. And when it's our sky, I can describe what a blue sky, what the color blue is, that experience of what it is to see color blue. But you can't do that from a computer. So I'm saying it has to be in your method, right? It has to be somewhere. It has to be in your method, Mr. Dennett. And it feels to me like Dennett just explains it away. And I'm like, well, negating an imagined experience is not, doesn't mean that it didn't happen for somebody. Is it, it's up to every individual to reconcile that using reason, just figure out what's applicable to the topic that they're trying to solve. And we have this amazing superpower computer that, until a problem like the traveling salesman gets solved and that are solved, and I don't know if you know, but it's like $1 million prize, right? I was thinking about that earlier, and I think the answer lies in the Hamilton equation. I think it's the Hamilton cycle. So it's like it goes on a pathway. Every single pathway it goes around the network. It only goes on one segment once. So by definition, it's like, I'm not saying it's the most efficient way, but it's the result that they're looking for. So and I was having a fun sort of mimicry writing session today about putting job applications in Hamilton, right, in Canada, in Hamilton, and saying we're looking for participants in this cycling salesman experiment, right? I thought that'd be very, very funny to do that, right? Because it's like,
yeah, I suppose one way to think of beauty is it's all objects, all creatures, have a certain nature that they're ordered towards. And so you could say that beautiful thing is in some way better fulfilling that nature. So like if you look at a beautiful painting, more accurately, represents its, whatever it's depicting. Or one thing I've been thinking about a lot as well is architectural beauty is like a beautiful building. So, but then different things can be beautiful in different ways. So like if you look at like some houses, there's some, if I look out and there's some beautiful Georgian houses out there, and they're beautiful in their context. But if you took one of those buildings and put it in in the middle of like a forest, they would no longer be as beautiful because they're not in the right context. They're not part of that grander scheme. So it occurred to me that one thing that makes a building beautiful is that, especially like a house or something within the middle of the city, is that it tends to kind of blend in with its surroundings, and then in that sense, it makes the whole system more beautiful. Whereas, say, so, but there are other types of buildings that typically are supposed to stand out. So, like I say, a palace or a church, and so those ones are meant to be something that rises above everything else.
Wow.
And so you have, there's like this ordered hierarchy of things that blend in, things that stand out, and you have a balance between them. So
Yeah,
one
you
thing
said
that's
some really
beautiful in
you've got
this, you
I
take it
have to
out.
jump in because I'm so
Yeah.
excited about what you're saying. This is so beautiful, the way you've explained it. Um, and I think that's really exciting to hear from you, because I think you're absolutely right. I think what you're describing is, we can say it's a hierarchy, but the value of ascending that hierarchy is really what you say that the commodity is, right? Right. I mean,
Mhm.
what is it that you're gaining by moving up that hierarchy
Mhm.
of ideas, right? And most of that is within yourself, right? You're constantly testing and moving and assessing things and moving up in your own internal hierarchy, which maybe starts to fill out some sort of self-worth sort of thing. But invariably, what your whole point was is that it's very network based and very bigger than you, right? And you can imagine, say you actually could apply like a percentage weighting to that. You could say that there's um, it, yeah, you could even get that information from people in the experience, like how important is your surroundings to your choice to be here to do whatever, right? How important has it been in your success or whatever else, right? And it's like, yeah, you're right. It's like the, the context and the setting could be like 50% of the decision.
Mhm.
And you say, well, how would you prove that? Well, and I like thinking about those kinds of things all the time. You'd say, well, do something where organically people were deciding this sort of thing, right? That's your baseline test subject. And you figure out, well, there's a community over here that has this characteristic, and one over here, and one over here, and one over here, and one over here. And, is that something that we can measure? And is that something that we can look at, in more detail with any sort of like things that we could derive from that? Like that's kind of a cool thing. The problem with those kinds of things is that I invariably get to a wall where I'm thinking it's like anything subjective is just never in a vacuum, right? So it's like you have to approach those experiments just methodologically different, and I found that maybe like the COVID situation is maybe a perfect example of that. I mean, people went from science is great to like, they're taking away my freedoms, and that's just that's sad,
Yeah.
and I think, whatever people decide, however we decide to define science, I think that we need to really take into consideration that there's uh, there's it serves people, and that people have varying degrees of understanding the world, and if it's like save one person at a time, well, I'm telling you, you gotta be kind of knowledgeable and being an effective communicator with your patients, right? And that means at a national level and an emergency level and everything.
Mhm.
I mean, so what would I do if I was running CDC? I'd say, okay, well, actually, we need to start making our protocols more obvious, apparent, audible. This is how we do things as a science team, a scientist. This is what we're looking for. Here's an explanation. Do a continuous series of like 10 YouTube channels so people can see and understand it. Probably won't be watched very much, but that's a great starting point. make it publicly, out there. I'm accountable to the public because here's my thought process, right? Here's how we're coming up. If this happens, this is called a stage 3 mutating, blah, 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 blah. Here's what rolls out in action for our team. And here's what our mandate is to tell the health professionals across all of the world. This is what we're preparing for, just to let you know. You say, well, I don't think it's right that we shut the businesses down. You're like, great, okay. So let's talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So it's very important to get those conversations started just so you can, everyone can, just be more open about things, more truthful, and you can go farther like that.
Yeah. I mean, and how to set it up, I think, we have all the ability to transform and tools into the world that we want to do it, and just through imagining them different. And that's kind of Platonic, maybe a little hopeful and wishy, because I'm not, I don't really like Nietzsche all that much, but it's like, you look at it and go, all of those people like me got slaughtered by all the Nietzsche people that decided, nah, fuck that. I'm just gonna, listen to my inner conquering self, right? So, anyways, I'm just saying that in the people that have similar feelings to me, I would say like a liberal tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I hang out with a lot of liberal academic types, right? And
Sure.
then I think your ideas are not that good, and and you don't handle criticism all that well.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there should be some more onus on explaining it to the public, because if you can't explain it to the public, I mean, does it exist? Really? I mean, you can't just say I've done all my work and now I'm done. I think things change, and that's one thing that you're the best to tell your story, right? If you're talking to an academic, you're the best person to explain it and be like, I don't get anywhere and people argue with me and it's a waste of my time. And I'd rather, like, well, okay.
You need to be able to explain your concept on different levels of comprehension. So, there's more at the professional level than, something down to make sure that it can, because if you can't understand, if you can't reword your own theory in different ways, do you really understand it?
Well, and I think the thing is that you can actually get to a very quick conversation and say, well, like, how can we mutually value this, right? Okay, so if you're an academic and you bring something to the governments, and I'm imagining governments as being in leaders in wealth creation for the citizens, right? They have the ability to put money in people's bank accounts, and I would say that, if you met with your local government representative and you said, look, I got a podcast that I can line up that's going to bring, the top 50 influential thinkers. Here's my program idea. Here's what I want to do. Would you support me on that? And I'm saying, so I don't have to do it as like a free hobby, unpaid sort of thing. Right. And, I honestly think we should live in a world where that sort of thing is encouraged. This is the equivalent of, the Greeks hanging out in the agora, talking about, things and ideal things, and having, meetings and stuff like that, symposiums, even, drinking parties, and just that culture of inner activity and engagement. And this is the only real form of engagement that is ideal, because responding on social media, you don't get the person's full response. We can't have somebody that's like, no, what I kind of mean is this, or do you think I could make my argument better if I had this sort of thing? Or I kind of see where you're coming from, like I understand that, but I'm kind of, you reason through it together and say, well, why is my thinking different than that person's thinking? You're like, well, okay, interesting. Why is it that you think that? Like, like you can kind of,
yeah.
You can kind of reason together. And I think reasoning together is one thing that could actually make Plato's dialogues better. And that's what I wrote a few of those. about trying to make the dialogue better. You do get a bit of a, like, they're just wonderful. I've reread the dialogues like 15 times, multiple translations, and I have most of them on the Planksip YouTube channel as well. I think 29 of the 35 dialogues. And for some of them, at least with the Republic, I went through and I put the Stephanus numbers, the Stephanus, I put those as timestamps throughout the whole dialogue, right? So what's cool is that you could write an article and you could say, well, this was such and such, 50 AD in Euthydemus or something like that, right? And then you can put the link and it goes right to there on the video, right? So, but dude, I tell you, it was just crazy to do all that. Like, it's hours and hours of work to go. You imagine going through line by line, and here's the Stephanus number. It goes right here. It's long. It's a lot of work. So I'd like to have all of them done, but I just don't.
Sure. How can one live a virtuous life? What is the key to having a more ethical life?
Well, you got to work at it. It's culture is cultivating. You got to lay seeds for tomorrow, to benefit you and the people around you. And then you have to nurture those, and you have to do it in an ideal way where you become a better man. And you know exactly how to do that. If you look at yourself, you can go, yeah, I know how I can improve myself. Yeah. Maybe it's that fear of public speaking. Maybe it's being man enough to say, I'm never going to be a public speaker, and defending it and owning it. Maybe it's just doing everything in your life and trying to stay out of the limelight. Whatever it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're interested in the cardinal virtues as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I just love the cardinal virtues. Yeah.
Would you mind discussing those? What the meaning of those, and how can we?
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, first you have something called prudence, which is really just well, let me try and maybe start with wisdom. Okay. So wisdom is something that you can kind of work at and cultivate. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can also have prudence, and you can be kind of careful. Right. And, lots of things can come into that sort of ideal, like the golden mean, nothing in excess, which isn't entirely under that section of cultivating, but definitely always playing in the background, right? Sort of thing.
Like prudence was the king of the virtues because it reins the rest of them in.
Yeah. So you can actually start to form a kind of like put them in sort of shapes, like prudence is overarching, and then, where does justice come in? That's really interesting to sort of imagine that, and which is another one, by the way, is justice. And so, you can look at these virtues and you can say, how do I cultivate them? How do I how do I focus on those qualities and then become naturally just a better person, right? And I think that's still very powerful. And I think there's an apologetic in there too, because I think there's a strong divide between atheists and theists. Mm-hmm. And I think that that can be mediated by understood better. I don't even actually know if it would be a coming together, right? I mean, what's the minimal viable product that you want to see come out of an exchange between a secular community and a theist community, right? You're going to say, well, can we at least agree on the wisdom that we can derive from that story? Mm-hmm. Can we at least agree on that, right? Can we agree that this is significant because the wisdom that we derive for it is this? Can we agree on that? you know,
Yeah.
and just say it over and over again and say, okay, so now we agree that, what we do about it or how we apply that wisdom, well, that's up for discussion. Let's talk about that.
Mhm.
But I think that's a way of working some of those in. And it's interesting, going back to your earlier comment, like, well, it does mean you say, well, we live in a society where it's like, sure, if you want to bring the outlier um, religion into we're open. So what would the faith of Islam say in a situation where you're dealing with X, Y, and Z? Oh, that's interesting. Okay. All right. Are they kind of saying the same thing, or what are they saying here? Like, how do you interpret that? Well, I interpret it like this. Oh, okay. So we're not too different in terms of the two camps, right? We're kind of
Mhm.
very similar. Okay. What other wisdom and insight can you bring based off of your religious teachings? Like, well, I could say this, you
Mhm.
know, I don't think it happens enough. Um, and I think we're holding on to remnants of trying to Newtonianize human behavior, right? Where, I mean, we can't dethrone it.
Too reductionistic.
Yeah, exactly. But we can't. We conceive and use of uh, what we sought after in the Enlightenment. We have become the Enlightenment culture, right? So now you say, okay, well, what did we give up? What was it about what we gave up that maybe was still pretty useful, and we didn't quite realize the fallout consequences for that, right? Um, and again, whether you can recover it or not, it's not the question, but it's interesting to ask the question, right? Like, we're moving fast through culture. So how do we adapt to it in a way that's healthy? Is it? So let me give you something more concrete. So if you talk about the conservatives, will talk about like a new world order sort of thing. This is like left conspiracy almost, right?
Mhm.
And the the left would call it a conspiracy, but the right would be like, come on, I don't know what it is, but it just seems to me like some of this is sort of going on, right? And so that's almost more dangerous than the evil dictator coming in, because you don't know that that's maybe um, something that your populace is trying to subtly warn you about, right? They don't entirely know why it's not right, but they know that immediately agreeing to something on that scale is just inherently bad. Or the public could be completely wrong, and that's kind of the point, is to go, well, we understand that there's a range of reaction here. What do we anticipate the reaction going to be, right? And why? And so I think this type of thing really needs to come into consideration. Take climate change, for example. Like, I was on LinkedIn the other day looking at someone's feed who was, we would call them a climate denier, or like advocate for the fossil fuel industry. And the amount of responses and engagement, and just read the comments. They're not stupid comments. They're like, yeah, they haven't properly thought it through from a rollout logistical standpoint. It's like, you're warning that, yeah, the world's going to come to an end, basically, but you're not telling us how to go A, B, C, D, E, F. Because the scientist is going, well, we're way down at W, X, Y, and Z. They're like, what do you want me to do? Right? Tell me, what is the next thing you want me to do? And the political part of it is that they're just like, we got to get the majority of people in every democratic and every world around the country to just jump on board with this. And as soon as you take anything out of their lifestyle, they're going to blame the party for who does that. And so the conservatives are going to always have that to fall back on perpetually, every election from now until the end of any kind of degrowth reality. So I think it's like back to the drawing board for the left.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that a lot of the problem with these miscommunications is, we're just, both sides are just they're playing two different language games, really. And I use Wittgenstein's term there, which is I think is very applicable. Um, but it's just two completely different worldviews coming from two completely different perspectives, and no one's willing to meet in that common ground. You're just talking past each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a weird thing, right? Talking past people, not miscommunication. We're like, wait a minute, are we really understanding, right? And I think that takes practice, but I think there's also people will respond to that. That's a authentic communication, and I think that there just needs to be a lot more of that. I know that's how I do things in my media outlet, for example, right? I mean, I publish books for people, and I say to them, I was going over a script today, and I just basically said, we've improved our process. We don't approach publishing like a publisher. We approach it like a project manager. How am I going to go through this, right? This isn't my revenue source. This is how can I get an author's work published, work with them, and have it mutually benefit us, right? So I got to pick the subject matters that matter the most, and I got to pick the most enthusiastic people that are willing to participate. That's the business model. We still offer advances for people to write and publish with us. Why? Because we'll say, oh, we'll put our money where our mouth is. You want to write a book? Here's 10 grand.
Yep.
Because who does that anymore? They don't. Even the big ones aren't really paying. I mean, if you're a famous author, of course, right? But I mean, most of them no. And we'll say, I thought the easiest campaign is to say, well, we'll pay you a $10,000 signing bonus, because the only thing you have to agree to is that we make the first $20,000 of your sales. They go, oh, $20,000 of my first sales. I go, yeah, because it's going to cost a lot of money to make content and promote content and get that machine going. So we're saying, at least pay us for what we spent.
Yep.
And they go, oh, that's right. You have to, it costs you to do this. Yeah. So we're going to do that for you, and you're going to pay us first. I mean, in anything, just say it's an interest-free loan with free labor.
Mm.
So anyways, that's how we approach the business model, is like, you don't have to turn a profit, but you just have to pay the bills.
How would you use what would you say are the practical uses of philosophy? Like, what can we use it for in our daily lives, in our careers?
I just think it makes us better problem solvers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it makes us better. That's only half. Better problem solvers, and I think being an introspective thinker is just absolutely essential to becoming a better person.
Mm-hmm.
You need to know how to improve on yourself, and how do you improve? You use that introspective thought, right? You think, okay, how do you apply it against and through the lens that is you, and you say, well, okay, I learned from that. I can improve on that. I know intuitively this is wrong. I shouldn't, kick that kitten in the head. I mean, people do that. It was actually the alliteration. It was the kick the kitten, right? So that's deterministically got me, but it's very cruel. So don't anybody kick any kittens.
I quite enjoy Wittgenstein's idea for what philosophy should be, and it's a tool used to solve problems in language. He said there are no true problems, philosophical problems. There are only problems in language, and so, which you need to use logic, philosophy to sort through those and get through what is the main point behind any statement you make. Would you agree with that? Or?
I do, but like the thing about Wittgenstein, he had this cult-like following. He even had like centurions that would go out to meetings and say, I'm here on behalf of Wittgenstein, and eventually people never even knew if he was actually real. like he became this like really sort of like culty, Oxford culty, like super high, amazing thinker or something like that.
Mhm.
Undoubtedly genius, right? I get that.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately, if you're going to really think about him objectively, you can say, don't intuitively you think that if you're studying the limits of language, right, and then you're defining them with logic, because he's an analytical philosopher, right? This is
Yes.
essentially what he.
Mhm.
So you're looking at it purely from an analytical standpoint, and you say, if in 95% of the first hour of our conversation was all about Platonic thinking having some sort of effect on the way and the outcome in this non-vacuous, non-vacuum based experiment, right? Okay. So there's some translation error between the mathematics and the logic into how we can um, anticipate and predict how humans are going to behave, right?
Mhm.
And so from that sort of standpoint, he becomes um, almost just like an incomplete thought. It's like, yes, there was value with Wittgenstein, but there's a lot of times I don't need to take that out of the toolbox because the value for me is like an antique. And I would
Mhm.
take it so far as to say an antique, because like I had mentioned earlier, I said in everything Descartes forward started to, if you imagine a big neural net for a brain, right? This is how we're forming new thoughts, right? And so boom, up pops Descartes, up pops Kant a little bit later, up, Schopenhauer, right? His disciple, right? So they're very offshoot, very working together, this kind of thing, right? Then you have Nietzsche that comes out of Schopenhauer, and you have like this. So it's this dendritic sort of thing, right? Okay, so it's going,
Mhm.
and it's just imagining. It's not. There's no big mind like like an electric storm. It's just that's not the thing. Sometimes you got to be explicit, right? Someone's like, "Did you hear this crazy philosopher? He's talking about this neural net, this electricity coming down and stuff." Look, just saying that's kind of how I'm imagining it. Okay. So then you have this sort of line of electricity coming down, and you say it kind of resembles like the neural net on a thing. And I go, that was myelinated. It's myelinating by our universities. We've got this ideal of teaching, and how do you reinforce it and teach it and imprint it and this type of thing. Well, we can do that in and through our structures of our learning structures. So that I'm saying you actually need to unlearn that and return back to ancient Greece and kind of grow out of those four cardinal virtues again. I think you need to reimagine things through the classics, and that, by the way, is the purpose of the classics. It's the purpose of it. It's why you can't escape Plato and Aristotle. And in one of my
A
books
good
I
starting
write,
point.
what's
Yeah.
that?
It's a good starting point to be grounded in. Yeah.
Exactly, right? And um, it's, yeah. So derive the wisdom from there, understand what came before, what affected it, what grew out of it, because those traditions have formed us. They've formed our ideals of democracy, of character, of ethics, of knowledge itself. And I think we owe ourselves a service to make sure we can understand that and be continued to be inspired by that. And I think we have a preoccupation with trying to discover a small bit of certainty in a vast ocean of, I don't know, what is the ocean full of. It's like, I don't know what it is. See, I can't keep up. I
Yeah.
don't know what to fill in there. But we could say, well, like from a story, what could the ocean of it be? Like you realize some might be corny, some might be, but what sounds good? What would we put there? What would we arrange in that spot? I don't know.
Sure.
Ocean of I
Of
have no idea.
mystery.
Well, there we've used, right. Okay, so you use mystery, right? Okay,
Mhm.
so you've used something that is an abstract concept too, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you say it was the ocean of stardust. Oh, that's interesting, because does
Mhm.
it kind of bring in the people like the deGrasse Tyson ones, where we could weave a narrative of it going, not like one step on either side, right? Trying
Hmm.
to use like conciliant language, right? And now I'm going to go to the point and I'll bring in somebody like Shelley, who says the poets are the legislators of society, right?
Hmm.
And so me using this poetic sort of like I'm being transparent with how I'm like not problem solving, but like applying imagery to it, and I can explain it with my words, and then you can go, okay, and we're in this Platonic space, right?
Yes.
And you can say, well, okay, so what would be the best thing there? And we can compare and contrast this what you suggest and what I suggest, and we can say, all right, we're at a deadlock, or what makes sense here, why would it be here, right?
Hmm.
So what comes to mind when you think of it? That's another important one too, which is trying to just go with your first instinct. For what reason? I don't know. It's the most expeditious.
Hmm. Hmm.
Why not?
Would you mind touching again on the idea of the poets as the legislators of society? Because I find that concept where
Yeah.
they're like spinning a web that that goes throughout out the culture that kind of gives a sense of structure to it, both descriptive and prescriptive, I suppose. That kind of describes how it is and how it should be.
Yeah. Uh, Descriptive and prescriptive. Yeah, that's interesting. How it is and how it should be. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you can make the claim that you just have something that is purely descriptive, and this just might come down to writing style or rhetoric, which is important. We have a negative connotation around it, but so we take information in different ways, right? So sometimes what do you scroll on? And here I'm saying in an environment of somebody to get small tidbits of information very quickly, and I can't help but think of channels like a social media or something like that. I think like how simple is it that it can be conveyed, and I could imagine something where you had a campaign that was going out, and it was just bullet points, right, in one situation, and then in another situation, to match what you're talking about, you'd have a bunch of imagined futures. What's the best way to do that? Well, maybe something that's horrific, people walking around a wasteland or something like that. And, that may catch more attention than trying to imagine what beauty looks like, right? So there, the function of that ordered arrangement is perverse in itself in order to extract and move to a greater good. And so you understand how this is all functioning really easily. Like we're kind of moving towards some sort of greater good, right, in our immediate vicinity, and in something that's for me personally, or me and my family and kin, or for the world at large, right?
Mhm.
So we're constantly trying to figure out how to bridge all of those overlapping hierarchies, right? And our relation in those kind of moves us up, kind of like that spider web I think you're referring to, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the spider web thing because a little bit of movement over here can really affect something way
Yes.
over on the other side, and
The butterfly effect, in a way.
yeah,
That instead of throughout time, it's throughout society.
and that's an intricate web then.
Yes. And yeah, it is amazing the way that one small thing in one side of the world can have major implications on the other side of it.
Yeah, yeah, and we're getting more and more like that, right? Like, what was it? Somebody was doing a comparison of COVID of how fast that spread versus the 1918 flu.
Hmm.
And like the CDC has this information. It's very interesting. Like it just spread so fast because we're such an interconnected world, right? And that's just a reality. We're all over. We don't have these isolated pockets of, and maybe from managing a health crisis, you just deal with those differently, right? Like if it took 6 months to get over to America, then you'd be like, all right, well, it's good to know, and you manage your responses accordingly. So we just live in an interconnected world, right? Like, I don't know if like bioweapons, that's different. That can be just localized.
Yeah, that
You
could.
could even, you know,
Mhm.
you could even bring up the N word with with Russia, right? And think, oh, but
Mm-hmm.
how big is it? What's the fallout? Will
Mm-hmm.
I be breathing like radioactive stuff?
The big one. Or of course with the technologies, but and AI, of course, is accelerating this greatly. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
what would you say is
yeah.
the future of AI in society? What would you say are going to be the main impact?
Chris, I'm really glad you've asked that. I've written a book soon to be published called Will Freeman. And the fundamental starting point for this book, it's a literary fiction. It was a challenge for me to write fiction. I normally write nonfiction titles.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. As a part of how I enjoy researching and I enjoy writing and creating. Right. So the idea of Will Freeman is that I think it was born out of the realization that we are framing things incorrectly. AI doesn't have to have a Terminator like take over the world feeling to it, where it feels like we're a society that's very scared of um, losing our reign, a little paranoid, if you will, right? Like the chances of this turning on and ending up like Skynet is just interesting at the least, right? And I think maybe an overreaction. I'm not saying don't look at it, but it seems like where we're focused, right? And
Yeah.
so, anyways, the idea of Will Freeman is very simple. Our society has a clear extinction timeline. Okay, so I
Mm-hmm.
think I wrote in the book it was 2070. So you'd imagine like it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. Everybody understands that there will not be another human past the year 2070. And I don't mean climate change, we think it's real. I think, and look, I mean, there are people in the world that think that climate change is not real and that the scientists have all been kind of misled, or the climate scientists have all been kind of like indoctrinated into this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way for um, uh, a fascist minority to take over the world and um, take away freedoms. Right. That's kind of what some people think. You say, okay, well, maybe there are some fundamental like tendencies in there that we need to be kind of like we're like keep an eye on, right? But for the most part, I think we can give some people the benefit of the doubt, I think, and allow some of these things to happen, right? I think we can be explorative with our structures and not be first to demonize and criticize and throw things out. I think we have to be efficient and prudent as we move forward, and that needs to reform what the conservative philosophy is, right? It has to be rooted in that. It has to be rooted in sensibility and long-term ethic of being responsible. I mean, it has to balance that short and long-term reality. And if it doesn't, it appears it's just not going to come from the left. We're kind of hooped. That's the climate change thing, anyways. But the AI story has more to do with we have an acceptance that humanity is coming to an end in 2070. And so imagine that's the case. You just agreed, you knew, just that's the way it is. Okay, big flashbang, we're all gone. But we do have an ability to, as our last effort to kind of leave some sort of remnant, is put our best foot forward on AI. That's what we're like singularly focused on right now. To say like instead of like, oh, it might take us over, say, oh shit, let's try and put our absolute, like all the best minds in the world on this project, because it's like, what else are you going to do? You got like nothing else matters. There's no escape from this. It's like our sun's going supernova or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I mean, I know that even information, we can't put it in a capsule and put it at the like the flashpoint or something like that. But I'm just like, somehow none of that matters. I'm saying like this is the reality. This is going to happen, right?
Yeah, like
So
there's a comet coming towards the Earth, or
yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, that's a better one, because then the whole universe doesn't. But and we have some sort of like contained vessel or something that could contain humanity's consciousness. Okay, there we go, right? Okay, there you go. So what does it look like? And I'm saying, well, try and put your best foot forward. This is philosophy in action. How would you build this? Right. And so, anyways, the book goes through the whole history of as memory, right? You're recalling is just like a human, except for instead of being able to recall bits and pieces gestalted across your lifetime, it actually is it spans multiple generations. So it by definition it pulls in more. And it changes it a bit because the translation actually adds something in of itself because it invokes the emotion of something. It's just not a beta, or it's just not a recorder of this, right? So sequentially, the idea was that as it kind of got revealed, it got more and more abstract, right? And so by second and third generation, you really couldn't entirely tell, but the idea was that the androids, basically neural net, can actually look at the reality in real time and go, okay, that was the reality, and not throw away that other sort of imagined layer. And it's like trying to use the imagination layer to move in a direction that is, I guess, just better, right? And so that's the extent of describing that kind of way the mind works that was put
It's kind of
into
like
the.
every bit of knowledge and piece of human consciousness condensed to one point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's kind of like, are you aware of the story of the Aleph? It's a Borges short story. Jorge Luis Borges
Yeah. Yeah.
wrote this story about every point of the universe condensed to one point called the Aleph.
Yeah.
And so you're able to look at it and see all of the universe in one small area.
Yeah. Yeah. It's beautifully anti um, Platonic in a way. Like it's not big and it's all condensed, and it changes this whole up looking at things to down, like, and it's just such a beautiful, yeah, it's a
Hmm.
beautiful concept. I think
Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
so the question is, Chris, is like, what do you do with that? Like, so another thing is like nothing, you just absorb it, right? You just say, okay, could you be inspired by something like that? Like, how could you create something with this, duality of like concepts there, right? I mean, how far philosophically can you take that? Do any ideas come to mind? When you kind of
What,
think about it,
yeah,
right?
what comes to mind? Can you find some sort of meaning in it? Or do you immediately fall into nihilism? What happens?
Well, that's interesting that you kind of take that. See, it feels like I'm an internal possibility thing. So like, imagine you're trying to create a meme in
Hmm.
a social media setting, right? And you're like, well, okay, so here are these two situations. Do we initiate a narrative that talks about falling into nihilism, right? Where it's like, so that's basically what you're saying. It's like a big slippery slope for society, right? And to me, it's a bit of a yawner in terms of not necessarily what will happen, but what is an ideal thing that could happen, right? Like, let's start there as a baseline, right? And say, well, we've got these, kind of two polarizing sort of things. How do we synthesize the two and pull the best of the two together, right? And make it better. So one's a warning, right? It's kind of like slow down, it's a speed bump. The other one is more like, how do we move into this? Like what does that information tell us? How can we synthesize it? Can we make the world a better place with that knowledge? Like, that's where I'm hoping the majority of young minds go, is a problem solving. What do we do with this information? How do we
Yeah,
synthesize? How do we make use of this? How do we apply this? Right?
yeah.
That's what I'm
That
hoping
that
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 figures
practical
do.
side of the philosophy is very important to get into.
Yeah, it's very important. Yeah.
You start out with the theory, and then you go into the practical side of it.
Yeah, I mean, somebody like David Hume, it was more of a hobby.
Hmm.
And he really was good because he kind of bucked the trend, right? He stopped this like excessive reliance This is one of the problems with um, the method that I'm describing, is that as it starts to mature like a plant, it needs to kind of be pruned, and it has a hard time pruning itself, right? It's like, imagine this is a human body. It's like, okay, you can't really hurt yourself all that much. I mean, it's like hard to inflict pain on yourself, right? So, I think you have to, kind of has to come, because we're not naturally masochistic. So I think it has to come from, a gentle amount of conflict in your life, and through problem solving and reasoning and this type of thing. I think it has to, this describes an ideal way that a society should work together. And so we got these two bits of information and be like, okay, what do we do? Should we make an essay competition and incite all of the youth 25 and under to write a paper? Would we give them money? I mean, sure, I do that. I blanks it. So you still got to get that out to enough people, and a lot of people to come in. Like, I mean, what do you do? What do you do with that information, right?
Mm.
That's the important thing. And sometimes you don't always know. Sometimes it's like, okay, that's good to know. I don't know how I'm going to use it. I'll kind of filter it away, right? Maybe I'll be able to come back and look at that, right? And I think writing helps with that. I think that's going to be the new method for writing, is a way to order your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. That's so important. The importance of writing, because there's so many people where they have some probably good ideas, but they don't structure them enough, and so they're not able to put them in that proper order, and so it comes nothing. But once you write it, it's you're able to look at it from a different point of view, because it makes sense in your head, but as it's coming out when you're speaking, it doesn't have the order. It doesn't make that same amount of sense. So when you write it down, you're able to look at it from more of an outside perspective and speak it.
I'm really excited to tell you about this, Chris. So we do this with authors. We help write books for authors that haven't been able to. We think of us as an incubator publisher. Really, I'm like, we publish just like any other publisher, but I was talking about this with somebody today. It's more like we're an incubator publisher, because I've sat down with writers and we just talk about their ideas in a 4-hour session. And now with the help of ChatGPT, I can go back and look at that, take the transcript, go through, summarize it by bullet point, right? While it's still fresh in my memory, and go, that's not really, I'm reconciling against the two with somebody who's like a virtual assistant, and I'm doing it really quickly, right?
Yes.
But you have to know what you're looking for and what to ask for, right? And so what I would say is that, use that technology. I use it. I help it, I use it for publishing books very quickly, because like you said, there's people like, they just need a little bit of help organizing and structuring their, their thoughts. I'd be like, give me 10 meetings with them and 24 hours and I'll have a book for him to review of his thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And, we live in a time where that is possible technology wise. Right. And, we found real success in being able to offer that with people. And we then work with them on developing their ideas on stuff like we're talking about here, like philosophy and philosophy, economics, neuroscience. I emphasize a lot on climate change, what I write about.
To learn how to write is to learn how to think, and that gets back to the Aristotelian idea of we're not just like souls trapped in bodies. Like our souls and our bodies, they're intertwined. We learn from the outside. Once we externalize our thoughts to the paper, there's that connection there. Connection to, you're moving your hand in to form the words on the paper, and you're learning them in a new way. You're able to look at it from a different perspective.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, as you say that type of thing, there's detractors. I don't know if you'd catch this, right? But there'd be um, kind of like a Daniel Dennett type that would say, well,
Mhm.
actually, Chris, nothing like that's really going on. The synapse is doing this and you're doing this and that's how it is. Right. You'd be like, okay, I get it. I understand all of that. So, but how we function in a society means we almost are immersed in a consciousness that is a narrative, right? You see now how the Platonic thing
Mhm.
starts to make a little bit of sense.
Mhm.
Like we've
Yes.
colored ourselves in a way that we can only see ourselves, right? And I think that any definition of consciousness has to have and accept that that is the description of the way things are. Like it is, um, I guess, like Heidegger said, I'm not really a super fan of Heidegger, but we're thrown into this world, right? We're thrown into it, and then the theater comes on, basically. Like the aspects of the world that aren't true, that they're like colored, they're brought, with extra meaning and attention. Um, those become very ingrained pretty quickly at a young age, right?
Yeah,
And
that's why.
almost like yeah.
Yeah, that's why I can't buy into that Dennett idea that which I think prematurely just writes off the whole thing, and fails to see the telos of these actions, the end effort, where it looks at all when you break down what these different actions are doing at different levels. It tries to isolate them too much and tries to eliminate like the cause and effect between you know A causes B causes C, but it tries to reduce that a little too much, forgets the chain of events within that broader scheme of things.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense.
Mm. How would you define consciousness, especially in the context of AI?
Mm. Well, building on what we were just talking about, I think consciousness has to describe um, the the has to have a cultural component of what culture is and how that's affecting
Mhm.
your experience, right? I think it's not, you can't define it as a monad. It has to be defined as a part of a network. So that's number one. And is that sufficient enough to provide as a definition for consciousness? Um, well, um, no, I think that's not sufficient. I think there I would rely on some of the work of Antonio Damasio's um, felt experience, where he says, hey, it is all in the brain, but don't forget about the spinal cord. It's
Mhm.
also there too. So it's this whole, like, that's where that's required for it. I don't want to get into anything spiritual, but I'm saying if that's not there, there's nothing happening,
Mhm.
right? If you don't have that, that's necessary. That's how it has to be there, right?
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about a transcendent reality or a religious, sort of understanding, I'm saying, well, fine, but belief does not happen without a spinal cord. It doesn't happen without a brain.
Mhm.
So it comes before. Just telling everybody that just it comes before. It may be preloaded with um, a predisposition towards learning religion or this type of thing. That I get. That's cultural, okay, and probably conceding to cultural evolution, right? Some mixture between the two of those, right?
Mhm.
But you got to be pretty careful, I think, with how you weigh the evidence, right?
Mhm.
And I think if there's a non-evasive way to better society by doing it kind of Daniel Dennett's way first, if you were going to set up a social experiment to like monitor something in real time, then find a problem. Okay, Daniel, what problem are you trying to solve? Does that have a fundament? You think it's going to go this way? Okay, well, let's set up an experiment to see if it goes that way. Daniel and Chris, on the other hand, think it's going to go more weighted this way. And we'd be like, well, we can't say anything because you guys are measuring anything. Like, how do I? Well, we got to put a survey at the end, right? Like this, right? And you
Hmm.
go, well, shit, that's not too reliable, right? But so, like, I don't know. How do I do it? I'd like maybe write a story at the end where you're describing it the best we can. Where you're like, here's like, the after notes, right? Of what the producers thought. Did we pull it off? Did we ask it in the right way? When we asked this question, could you have done it better? You could do that, right? You'd have to kind of create an experiment. And then you actually got people that are just reacting under some other normal everyday pretense. And you go, wow, maybe that is like another butterfly taken off, and another one, and another one, and another, and then all of a sudden the field goes, like, I don't know.
Hmm.
Right? Very interesting. Like yeah. And I think if it doesn't encapsulate a universal, right? Which is easier said than done. If it doesn't encapsulate a universal, then we have to inherently agree that it's normative.
Hmm.
So it just means, hey, this is what everybody agrees on, right? We're doing this, but I'm not saying that it can't change because it's not fundamentally built on a universal, right?
Hmm.
Kant tried to do this a little bit differently, that there's a ethics, like a universal ethic, right, underneath everything. And I tend to agree with that, but basically what's happened is they've dethroned goodness as the ideal and said that, and kind of gone the other way and, looking downward, and, you say up or down, whatever, light, dark, this kind of thing, right? And you say that it's like you're mounting an advertising campaign that's going in an opposite direction, something that science shouldn't be, you know, conveying in that particular way. Like, when they made the comment that Newton represented light, that, that's true. I mean, that's a true, genuine awakening. That's true. You have the world here, and you have us trying to understand and interpret it, and we just got an upgrade to our optics. Thank you, Newton. Wow, great. Right?
Yes.
And the optics is like a real good analogy because he worked in optics, and he's like, and actually, I'm a 58-year-old man, and I see in this particular way. Right? Now, does it mean that quantum physics is not real or happening? It's like, but I can't see, in a way, I'm kind of poking fun at it, because it's like, I can still see the Newtonian world,
Hmm.
but what I've been convinced of is that there's an atomic, we know it's real, right?
Yeah.
Because of nuclear bombs and all this kind of stuff. But you have like this thing that we can barely imagine, like a pencil dot on a paper is like the entire universe to an atom. So
Hmm.
we're like these massive, like, blundering giants, walking around like on nothingness, held up by atom.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Yeah. One thing that you were also interested in talking about was something about God versus good, which I'm not sure exactly what you meant by that, but
The God versus the good is the monotheistic God that emerged out of ancient Greece. I believe was formed out of this ideal perfection. Okay,
hmm.
and then you saw the Jewish tradition get very influenced by the Greek tradition. I'm not saying it predated it. I'm thinking elements of it predated, but it was definitely shaped and partially formed by the Western tradition. It had influence. Okay, we can all agree on that.
Mhm.
And then what derived from the Abrahamic? Well, we have Islam and we have Christianity and all
Mhm.
the offshoots, right? Okay, so we've got such a massive, I guess, revival of a religion, right? Okay, it has progressed through time. And so I'm basically saying, what did all of these have in common? Well, we know that monotheism means that they all came from this one idea of a God, right? And what I'm
Yep.
saying is that within a 400 or 500 year period, we took Greek, which the Bible was originally written in, and it was like, okay, good was something that was abstract that we were moving towards. And if you look at our reality of taking something in an abstract form, we're trying to move it into a more concrete thing that we understand. And so we try to imagine it as a person. And what's more intuitive, you can easily feel what it means to be like an ideal something, even though you can be like, I kind of understand how it would be to be like God, whatever, blah, blah, right? But you're like, I can't even conceive of it. That's why in the Jewish tradition, you're not even supposed to even say Yahweh, right? So anyways, this is kind of the idea. It connects with our psyche a little better if we can picture it like a human, right? And so that's what I thought. That's what I think. And and same goes for Jesus, right? I mean, here you've got his son, you've got an ideal man, savior, right? He's going to save the world. Okay, great. He's already done that, or he's coming back. I don't know,
Mhm.
right? But what I do know is that as a heuristic, it's an amazing thing or it's something beautiful that you can imagine that. You can say, well, I know what the right thing to do here is. What does it mean to be a man? What do I owe my community? Right? I mean, like all the lessons that we learned from the Socratic dialogues. So, a noble man. What is a
Mhm.
noble man? Okay, well, it's no longer a Homer inspired or tale of Achilles or a warrior. The hero is an intellectual person, a philosopher.
Interesting. Yeah.
But
Uh,
I should probably get going here pretty soon. I
sure, I just wrap it up. Uh, what's your favorite and least favorite philosophers?
well, probably revealing that I love Plato so much, eh?
Mhm. Not counting Plato, I should say.
Oh, okay, okay. Well, that's fine. Yeah, okay, all right. Um, I have to say just for a minute. So I did these custom literary tools, right? And basically scrapes the indexes of books and tries to figure out who they're talking about the most, and you can kind of lay a groundwork like for a book review, right? I guess of where the underlying theme is. We have this thing called the P A I think filter or something like this, right? So there's this part of the code where it was like you take off the Plato, Socrates, right, and Aristotle,
Mhm.
and I don't know if it was Alexander the Great, but you take the trilogy of those out of it, and then it allows, at least in the genre, it allows the instance count for other things to kind of surface up, and for you to be able to say, oh, okay, so in that sort of curve, we take out those like 95% of the references, which were kind of like Greek related. And it was like, well, what else kind of surfaced? And then you find some interesting things that you don't really pick up normally, right? So, anyways, I don't know why I thought of that. I mean, I do know why I thought of that, but I won't. I won't. I feel like I'm rambling. But besides Plato, who do I go to the most? I really like Arthur Schopenhauer.
Sure.
Um, Yeah, he's really good. Is the opening line to his his thesis document on the fourfold root of sufficient reasoning or something like that. It's so beautiful. He quotes Plato and Kant, and he talks about how we collect things, right? And maybe in our minds, right? Collect and categorize, right?
Yeah.
And then we simultaneously have this function of parsing, getting rid of things too, right? Like, right, kind of like shedding things off, right? And how do you do that? Well, and that to me, that sort of like working together thing that Schopenhauer describes in his fourfold root is just absolutely, to me, how it works. It's just it's how the mind works.
Mm-hmm.
And then fine, layer in Pinker on there on how the mind works. Definitely, I get all that. Sapolsky on behavior, yeah, I get all that. But
Yeah.
I think I can relate with that sort of fundamental force, right, of battling, and I think it's
But yeah,
makes things.
psychology really takes its roots from philosophy, before it became more of a science.
Yeah.
When it kind of started more around that time period, really, mid 19th century. What would your advice be to young people that are interested in getting started in philosophy?
Um, Return to the Greek writings and enjoy them. Um, yeah, just to try and enjoy yourself and try and find out why ancient Greece is the reason for the classics. Because there's a vast ocean, like we were talking about, of amazing inspiration in that time period. And it's if you're a woman, try and overlook the idea that it's a male centric. It is male centric. There is definitely a little bit of that. To give it the benefit of the doubt, say war was a very prevalent and immediate reality. But I will say women had an incredible power, and I think the Greeks knew that too. They just didn't quite write about it, and I think that's maybe one of the failings. But it gives females an understanding or a call to action, basically, to say, look, maybe I should look at it, try and look at it from a positive light, and try and talk about what's good, right? And in our post-modern society, the simple way out is to say, oh, it's crap, it's this and that. It's like, well, try and create something. It's a little harder than it looks, right?
Yes.
So that's what I would say. Is I'd say focus on the classics, and I don't know ancient Greek. I don't know if I'll be able to get there, but I'd like to get there. I'd like to, if I had the time, to learn ancient Greek so that I can kind of try and empathize with the words just a little bit more, right? So the younger you are, the easier it is to learn. And I think it'll stay with you a lifetime.
Who is your least favorite philosopher?
Well, I think it's Nietzsche. I find I get very frustrated reading Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm.
But part of it, I also know that he's such a brilliant man, and he's was a brilliant man and troubled, and some of his stuff kind of like you can kind of admit that side of humans, right? I mean, there's that idea of an ideal person, but there's also a dark side and a reality of people too, right? And I think that that's not worth forgetting, but I think you need to spend a lot less time pointing out those things. I think they're important to point out, but then you kind of return back and say, all right, then the ideal looks a little bit different. You know, we've taken that into consideration, but don't dichotomize and say, one is just tear down one and then, use the second one, kind of thing that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I think you need to really think about, what the value of the past was, for sure. And well, with Nietzsche, he's he's a very talented writer. One thing I will say that I really can empathize with is that there was one the scene. I can't remember what book it was, but he wrapped his arm around the horse and he
hmm
just collapsed. Um, I think it was Gay Science, and I thought to myself, I go, here's a man that I can empathize with. He just loves his mind, right? I mean, he might be tortured in it, but he's very high functioning in introspection and philosophy, right? Like you have to be comfortable with your mind because it's like what you work with all the time, you know,
sure.
right? So, anyways, you've got either you love it or a very very healthy respect for it, right? Because it really defines you. And I think that he could probably, and he was probably aware, and this is kind of haunting, that he was starting to lose his mind. That's what
Yeah,
I kind of think was really facilitated the breakdown. That in combination with just seeing the visual of a horse strapped like blinders on, okay, emaciated. Um, and I want you to think that he just totally one-on-one empathized with it. And first, you kind of have to imagine what is it like to be a horse, right? I mean, kind of Nagel thing or whatever, right? But the horse wants to be out in a field, wants to be running around, wants to have other horses around it, right? Um, and it's an animal, it's a mammal. It just I'm not saying you can totally anthropomorphize a person in that situation, like we're strapped down and we're being, we're carrying shit all the time and this and that. I get it, horse has been domesticated, but still there's like a healthy respect for another animal, right? And say, well, does the animal deserve to be used in that particular way if we don't have to do that, right? And you can kind of start to have that sort of conversation. And anyways, I think Nietzsche looking at it and now and just like using pure empathy with this animal is like it's suffering. Its mind is being completely erased because like how does it remember being able to run in a field? Like we have this ability to imagine all this sort of stuff, and what I bet you it does a little bit to a degree,
hmm
but you're absolutely taking away everything from it, even since it doesn't have quite the hope mechanism that we have. It's like you're completely throwing this animal into a version of hell.
hmm
Like there's no way this is the best life for this other, sentient being, right? And either that resonates with you or you're like, well, it doesn't, you know.
sure.
I find it shocking if it doesn't resonate with you
hmm
because it's
hmm
worth acknowledging, right? Like,
Yeah,
is that our starting point, right? I mean, I'm saying species die, but I mean, at what point you could say, yeah, at what point? I mean, bacteria dies. Do I get sad? No. Is it a mammal? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, probably. I mean, it's like, you know, can we at least acknowledge that, that there's something going on there with the slaughtering of the animals and how it's happening and stuff like that?
hmm Yeah, there's definitely certainly a higher level of consciousness if you compare the different levels of animals. If you compare a mouse to a horse, for example, uh, and so there certainly I would say probably the higher level of consciousness, the closer the potential connection that we can form to them, because it's just easier to understand them because of that closer level.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, it's kind of Socrates' idea of friendship is that is that highest level of friendship of connection you can have with someone else is is that deep intellectual bond. And so naturally, if you talk about connections between like a human and a horse, for example, it's going to be easier to easier to form than with some lower animal.
Yeah, I guess I could see your point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I gotta get going because I got an appointment to get to here.
Okay, well, it was great having you on, Daniel. Is there any place that people go to find out more about you?
Yeah, the easiest way is just plank, like a piece of wood, sip, like a hot cup of coffee, planksip.org. That's where,
Planksip.org.
yeah, planksip.org.
All right, thanks for coming on. This has been a Counterpoint Media production, Point Counterpoint. I'm your host, Chris Wright. Thank you.